It's 8 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight. Policing and protests back in the spotlight after a group of people climbed a war memorial in central London but avoided arrest. Well, the police say the protesters' behaviour was unfortunate and disrespectful, but not against the law. Coming up, as the government suggests the police could be given new powers to protect monuments, we'll ask if this is the next flashpoint between ministers and the Met. Also tonight, my sons were watching football. Scotland's Health Secretary gets emotional in Parliament as he explains the £11,000 iPad bill he racked up while on holiday. A deported killer offers to return to Britain to show his victim's daughter where her mother is buried, more than 50 years on from her death. And I'll be speaking to Will and Caro Greenwood about the legacy of their son Freddie and what they're now doing to help the parents of other premature babies. All that to come and much more on the UK Tonight. There are new questions tonight over protests and the police. This is after a group climbed onto a war memorial in central London last night but avoided arrest. The head of the Metropolitan Police said the group's actions were inflammatory and he regrets that officers didn't arrive on the scene in time to stop them scaling the monument. But crucially, Sir Mark Rowley said that the group didn't actually break any laws. Veterans Affairs Minister Johnny Mercer has called the protesters thugs. And Number 10 said it is once again considering giving the police new powers. Sky correspondent Ivor Bennett has this report.
Police, protesters and a war memorial.
The monument now. Brother, keep respectful.
Keep respectful, one says. Too late for that. The pro-Palestinian demonstrators scaled the Royal Artillery Memorial after a protest outside Parliament. Officers were present, but no arrests were made, prompting criticism of the police.
More disgraceful scenes last night, so why did your officers stand by and watch?
And more questions inside. The Met Commissioner couldn't escape.
Some might say those events prove the point the old Home Secretary was making, that the Met is guilty of playing favourites with some protesters. What would you say to that?
It is not illegal to climb onto a statue. I think that might be something that government may consider, but that's for them to decide, not for me. The officer recognised that whilst it wasn't illegal, it was sort of unfortunate, inflammatory in certain ways. The officers at the scene asked them to get down, and they did. So the officers intervened, as officers often are doing, to try and de-escalate risk of conflict, even when there is an explicit power to do it.
But there is nevertheless both public and political outrage. Veterans Minister Johnny Mercer saying, "We've got to stop thugs clambering over war memorials. The Met has a lot of powers they can use and should be using, and I'll work with colleagues to toughen the law. Let's see these thugs dishonouring our war dead in handcuffs." Events here have once again put the Met at the heart of a political debate about public order policing. But it's no longer just about how they handle these protests. It's also now about whether they have sufficient powers to deal with them. And in that respect, some believe the laws need to be strengthened. And that's where the new Home Secretary comes in.
Should climbing on the centre shelf be legal?
James Cleverly said he'll now look at giving police new powers to protect war memorials. But first, a new relationship with government.
I will back you when you do the right thing. And I want you to know that I will be critical if I think you need to be critical, but I will always attempt to do so professionally, calmly, directly.
It's a clear shift in tone from his predecessor, who's now avoiding the spotlight. But the change in personnel doesn't mean a change in climate for the Met. This was a march by school children in East London today, hundreds leaving their classrooms to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. The protests aren't going anywhere, nor is the politics and the pressure. Ivor Bennett, Sky News.
Well, Let's bring in Lord Walney, who is an independent advisor on political violence and disruption at the Home Office. He joins me now. Lord Walney, good to see you. Thank you for joining us on the UK Tonight. Just want to first start by asking you, when you saw those scenes of the group climbing on the war memorial, what did you think?
It's appalling. Your gut reaction, like I would imagine the overwhelming majority of the population, is this should not be happening. Layered on top of the deep sense of disrespect and outrage is there is a heightened level of tension around these marches. There have already been counter protests, and the police have had a very difficult job. Aside from the question of whether the marches should be going ahead at all, surely activity like this is a significant risk of further inflaming a difficult situation. So we need to find ways that it doesn't happen.
When you say find ways, do you mean new laws? Because what that group did was, you've called it appalling, the Metropolitan Police have called it disrespectful.
Yeah.
But it's not illegal.
Well, I mean, I think that there is a very live debate about whether existing laws could capture this. There is specific mention of war memorials in the new Police Crime and Sentencing Act of last year. Now, that specifically relates to damaging memorials. There's a question of whether that could come into play here, and whether parts of the Public Order Act, as it stands, could be used. The Met has got a clear view on this, it seems, but I hope that they'll look again at the suite of powers that they have, because, of course, it is often a cumbersome and can be an imperfect way of to have legislators making new laws to deal with situations. If it can be done under the existing suite of laws, that would be much more preferable. But clearly, there is some significant disagreement over that at the moment.
Yeah, we're just watching those scenes from last night again, and they are extremely uncomfortable to watch. Yeah. Nobody should be climbing on a war memorial honouring the dead. However, is there a danger of blowing this out of proportion in terms of, if you listen to the audio, the police weren't there to protect the monuments, they were able to climb on it, but you can't legislate for idiots. They were asked to come down politely by the police officers, and they did that. So is there a danger that we're perhaps blowing this out of proportion when we talk about, incorporating this into law?
Well, I mean, people are arrested for doing idiotic and inflammatory things all the time, and I think there is there's a wide public will to prohibit this. I think one of the things which I hope that the Met will consider is whether, as an interim measure, you could build into the conditions for allowing the protest to go ahead, that there is not this level of disrespect or any disrespect for war memorials, particularly.
But at any protest march, at any demonstration, there will be breakaway groups of, let's for argument's sake call them idiots, those who go against the wider point of a march. I mean, if you look at the estimated figures from the Metropolitan Police, there were 300,000 people on the streets on Saturday, over 100 arrests. So putting that into context, that's a small number of people disrupting an event that passed off fairly peacefully in those terms.
I mean, Sarah-Jane, I think it's important that we don't, in these circumstances, measure the number of arrests and therefore equate this to it being a peaceful march. Actually, I think
what evidence do you have that it wasn't peaceful?
But one of the problems, I think.
What evidence do you have of it not being peaceful? Because we have to deal in facts here, and if you were there, you could talk about eyewitness accounts. Police have been gathering evidence from the march and are appealing to find 11 men for hate speech and supporting Hamas. So all the measures are in place, but in the main, you can't say that march didn't pass off peacefully in the main.
But I think one of the real problems, and the case that I've been trying to make to the police and publicly today, is that the police do not feel, it seems, that they can enforce the law on the marches as it happens, because they are allowing they are apparently allowing blatantly anti-Semitic material that is glorifying terrorism to go past officers and not arrest them at the time, presumably for fear of inflaming the situation, losing control. Now, everyone will sympathise with their need to keep the marches under control in the moment, but I think that does raise a question of whether if a march can only go ahead and be kept quote unquote orderly if officers do not enforce the law, then I think that calls into question whether the marches should be being allowed in the first place, particularly given the level of fear that they are generating, and they are clearly at least an aggravating factor in the explosion of anti-Semitism which is happening, which Jewish people in the capital and across the UK are being subjected. And in those circumstances, I think it's right that the marches themselves are called into question, aside from this issue of if they are going ahead, how you stop the appalling incidences like we saw yesterday.
OK, Lord Walney, really good to get your point of view here on the UK Tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, former Scotland Yard Superintendent Nusrat Mahtab joins me now to discuss this. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll start with the same question for you. When you saw that footage of that group of men climbing on the war memorial, what did you think?
I agreed it was uncomfortable and it shouldn't have happened, but it shouldn't have happened to breaking the law are two different things. And what people feel is uncomfortable and don't want to see isn't illegal. And we've got to stay away, and I think it's very important for me to say this, is not to demonise and criminalise a section of our community, and particularly the marches that have been taking place, because, you know, what we find uncomfortable, if it's not against the law, it's not there. There isn't the legislation to climb memorials. And then your last guest mentioned the sentencing bill, the criminal sentencing bill, which came in last year. That dealt with criminal damage to monuments that came as a result of Black Lives Matter and people pulling down those statues. That's different to somebody climbing up on there, which is, you know, which I agree with you is uncomfortable, and then being asked to come down. He came down, was respectful. Actually, he was coming down when his friend told him. He was respectful, there was no damage, wasn't committing an offence. It's not a public order offence. I know your last guest was saying, well, it could be a public order offence. Well, it wasn't, because Section 4 of the Public Order Act and even Section 5 doesn't allow for that, because there's no threat of violence, and certainly breach of the peace, that doesn't apply because there's no damage to property or persons. So if there isn't a law, what we find uncomfortable doesn't necessarily mean is illegal, and that young man needs to be arrested for that. I've heard some of the language used by Johnny Mercer, calling what happened with him climbing up there thugs, referring to them as thugs, and some of the language that your last guest has used, you know, outrage and we should.
So you think it's been blown out of proportion, this particular incident? Because it's feeding into that narrative, isn't it? In fact, Lord Walney was talking about it then, saying, you know, it just feeds into the fact that, you know, there is a chain of thought that these protests shouldn't go ahead. And part of that narrative is police powers. He was saying that, you know, that march, he felt that the police couldn't intervene when there was hate speech because of the sheer number of it. It's all being done reactively. What are your thoughts on that, on police not intervening if they see people on the spot in a crowd of 300,000 blatantly supporting Hamas?
Right. You know, when there's so many people, and for the police to go into that situation and try to pick one or two people out is dangerous for the people that are on the march and the police officers after themselves. Now, look, you know, justice delayed isn't justice denied. And we know that a lot of the time, the best tactic to do is not to steam in, but it's to wait, because there's social media clips, there's other evidence, CCTV, and people are being arrested 2 weeks later. they are being arrested. And I do agree with you. I think we have to keep it in proportion. Common sense has to prevail. Look, Jane, climbing statues, New Year's Eve. If you started to take everybody that climbs Nelson's column on New Year's Eve, the cells across, Britain would be full. Football supporters climbing statues. So I think that there is something about keeping our perspective on this. And in terms of getting new legislation, let's not do a knee-jerk reaction just to get new legislation in, because that...
Are the police in an impossible situation there? Because there is something particularly sensitive about this march, and Lord Walney talked about it. The Jewish community in London, looking at 300,000 people, en masse marching through London, that is intimidating. Whether there's a small minority supporting Hamas or not, that is an intimidating sight for the Jewish community in London. Yet police operate on intelligence about major disruption or potential violence, and there just isn't that. There may be incidences of hate speech and anti-Semitism, and that's really hard to police. So the police are just in a really difficult spot. They don't seem to be able to win here. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a very fair assessment. Seeing so many people march, look at the message of the march. 300,000 plus people marching to end the conflict, to end the tsunami of human suffering that we've seen. Surely that's not intimidating. You've had all faiths. There's people from the Jewish community, people from the Muslim community, all different faiths going to those marches. And I think to have one narrative and to demonize 300,000 plus people going on a march is so wrong, and it feeds into that narrative. All this has come about, favoritism, being biased is from the Home Secretary. We didn't have this in the 3 weeks previous to the march on Saturday. All of a sudden, the Home Secretary writes her article on a Wednesday, and it's just blown all out of proportion. And I think the government shouldn't introduce new legislation. There is legislation already out there, but if somebody isn't committing an offence, what would these people like to see? People just being arrested because, public opinion is that these marches shouldn't go ahead, or climbing a statue, they should be dragged off and put into jail. That's not how a democracy works. It's about the freedom of speech and the freedom of right to protest. Let's start to respect that, regardless of whether we like the cause or not.
Mm-hmm. Police don't follow public opinion, of course, they follow the law. Nusrat Mehtab, former Scotland Yard Superintendent, thank you for your time this evening. Thank you. And now, an inquest has found that police made a number of errors in the case of a woman who was stabbed to death by a colleague she'd accused of stalking her. Gracie Spinks had reported her concerns to officers, but they decided the man was low risk. Our North of England correspondent Katerina Vitozzi has this report.
Gracie Spinks was brutally stabbed by a man, a former colleague, that she'd reported to police for stalking her.
I called it off because I didn't have no feelings for him. And then he became obsessed with me and wouldn't leave me alone. And basically loads of things happened. And then on the 4th of January, before work, he was sat waiting at my horse's field, waiting for me to go there, which scared me a lot.
The 23-year-old died just months later, killed by Michael Sellers, captured here on CCTV. He stabbed her at the stables where Gracie kept her horse. Sellers took his own life later that day. The jury were asked to consider two major police actions. First, their response to that call that Gracie made to them in February 2021. And secondly, their response to a bag of offensive weapons found close to the stables where Gracie was later killed. And that bag contained things such as a knife, an axe, and a note that said the words, "Don't lie." In front of Gracie's heartbroken family, the jury found in both events the police hadn't done enough to investigate. Sellers was deemed low risk. The bag, which also contained Viagra tablets, dismissed and destroyed.
The police officers involved in Gracie's case drove a coach and horses through the concept of basic policing and common sense, ignoring the obvious risks, investigating absolutely nothing, and recording absolutely nothing. If this is the prevailing culture at Derbyshire Constabulary, then this is not a handful of bad apples, but the entire rotten orchard.
Today, police are apologised.
But simply, as a force, we failed Gracie. And for that, I can only offer my own and the force's most sincere apologies.
The 5 officers involved in the case have been sanctioned but continue to be on the force, which says since Gracie's death that it's appointed a stalking coordinator. Gracie's family say it still isn't enough, but it's a start that all victims deserve.
I'd like to think that Gracie will make some changes across all the police forces eventually in this country, so they all do the same thing and they all deal with stalking in the same way, with proper training first of all, and advocates in place to deal with stalking complaints, and a coordinator to coordinate that. So I want to make some changes in Gracie's name. If we could call it Gracie's Law, Gracie's Change, whatever, that's how I'd like her to be remembered, and then her death wouldn't have been in vain.
In moments like this, we often hear the phrase, lessons will be learnt. In the wake of such tragedy, Grace's family hope they are. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News in Chesterfield.
Scotland's Health Secretary has apologised today for a hefty £11,000 data roaming bill on his parliamentary iPad. In an emotional statement to MSPs, Michael Matheson explained it was caused by his sons watching football while he and his family were away in Morocco. Now, the minister had initially billed the taxpayer, but he says he has now reimbursed Parliament in full.
As a parent, I wanted to protect my family from being part of the political and media scrutiny associated with this, something I believe any parent would want to do. I am a father first and foremost. I can see now that it's just not possible to explain the data usage without explaining their role. Presiding Officer, the simple truth is they were watching football matches. On Tuesday, I told the First Minister that members of my family had made use of the iPad data, and yesterday evening I provided him with a full account of the matter and of my intention to inform Parliament. Presiding Officer, disclosing this information about my family has been extremely difficult. Mistakes have been made by me and by my family, and mistakes have been made in the way in which I've handled this. I should have sorted the SIM card. I should have investigated what happened more thoroughly. I accept that, take responsibility, and I apologise unreservedly.
Met police officers are to be investigated for gross misconduct over serial killer Stephen Port. Details on that coming up. And the Chancellor contradicts the Prime Minister's timeline for when the controversial Rwanda policy could be put into action. And no need for the GP, the contraceptive pill is going to be made available over the counter at chemists.
Michael Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world, the likes of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sir Elton John. We try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Hello, welcome back. You're watching the UK Tonight. Here's what's coming up. I'm going to speak to Will and Caro Greenwood to mark World Prematurity Day. They'll be discussing their son Freddie's legacy. And we'll get the latest on the investigation into the felling of the world-famous sycamore gap tree in Northumberland. But first, we're going to take a look at some of the other stories making news in the UK tonight. And 5 Metropolitan Police officers and 3 former officers are being investigated for gross misconduct following the force's failings in the case of serial killer Stephen Port. In a statement, the Met said it was deeply sorry for the failings in their response, and they described the deaths of the 4 young men as a tragedy. The Chancellor has contradicted the Prime Minister's timeline for when the controversial Rwanda policy could be put into action. Jeremy Hunt said today there is no guarantee deportation flights to Rwanda will take off next year in an apparent climb down on the government's position. It comes after the PM said flights would take off in the spring, with the government planning to introduce a legally binding treaty to get around the Supreme Court's ruling that the policy is unlawful.
We are hopeful that because of the solutions that the Prime Minister announced yesterday, we will be able to get flights off to Rwanda next year. We can't guarantee that. We have to pass legislation, emergency legislation in the House of Commons. We have to sign a new international treaty with Rwanda. But our commitment to the British people is that although the Supreme Court ruling was a setback, we will not allow anything to get in the way of delivering the Prime Minister's pledge.
The first case of a strain of feline coronavirus that has killed thousands of cats in Cyprus has been found in the UK. It's called feline infectious peritonitis, or FIP, and it's generally fatal unless treated. Well, it was found in a cat brought to the UK from Cyprus, and experts say cat owners now need to be vigilant, but they don't need to start keeping their pets inside. A 16-year-old boy who was arrested after the felling of the sycamore gap tree is to face no further action. Northumbria police have been investigating after the tree was deliberately chopped down back in September. 2 men in their 30s and a man in his 60s were also arrested on suspicion of criminal damage. They remain on police bail. Millions of women in England will soon be able to get free contraceptive pills from high street pharmacies without having to see a GP. It's all part of attempts to increase the accessibility of contraception and reduce pressure on doctors' surgeries. Our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi, has this report.
Sukhvir Basra's pharmacy is busy, but now she'll take on even more work. Next month, for the first time, women will be able to get the pill here without seeing a GP first.
This is a really good system to allow us to have that accessibility. We're already trained clinicians. We know what medication's required for certain conditions, and this is an acknowledgement of our skill set.
Hugely controversial when first made available some 60 years ago, surviving legal challenges to become so easily available across a high street counter. Women's reproductive health choices have come a long way. New mum Jennifer took the pill for 13 years and agrees that women need good access to safe and reliable contraception. But she worries that might mean some will not be able to make informed choices.
When I wanted to have the pill when I was 17, my doctor explained to me all the other options apart from the pill and what might be best for me, rather than just going and buying something over the counter.
The move is designed to both help women and to ease pressure on GPs. The pill's just the start. The government's Pharmacy First initiative will see pharmacies like this one treating up to 7 conditions by the start of next year. The new health secretary told me improving access to care is one of her top priorities.
We're going to be rolling out new powers for pharmacists to help people with 7 of the most common and basic conditions. So really freeing up to 10 million GP appointments, we think.
But some doctors think it's a good idea in theory, but warn that in real terms it will do little to ease GP pressure and improve patient access.
In general practice, we're seeing nearly 1.5 million patients per day, and this scheme is scheduled to free up roughly 10 million appointments. So around about a week's worth of appointments, and that's not even going to happen immediately.
Sukhvir is confident that she and her pharmacy colleagues can deliver, but only if the sector is given the support it needs to meet its new challenges. Ashish Joshi, Sky News in Victoria.
Still to come on the UK tonight, a deported killer offers to return to Britain to show his victim's daughter where her mother is buried, more than 50 years on from her death. We'll have the details. Welcome back. Now, for every 13 babies born in the UK, 1 is born premature. Preterm delivery remains the leading cause of neonatal death in the developed world, but amazingly, there have been no new treatments for half a century. Earlier today, I sat down with Will and Caro Greenwood. They lost their son Freddie after he was born prematurely at 22 weeks. I asked them what they want Freddie's legacy to be and what they're doing to raise awareness of preterm birth.
Caro and Will, I think it's only right that we start by talking about Freddie. Caro, Freddie was born prematurely at 22 weeks. Tell me about what happened.
You don't know what it's like to be pregnant for the first time, and it's all the excitement, all the scans, all of which went very, very well. And I was visiting my mum and my waters broke. But even then, I wasn't sure what was normal and what was not. I did end up going to the local hospital, and they essentially told me that my waters had broke and it was unlikely that they would reseal, but there is always a chance. And very sadly for me, they didn't, and I went into spontaneous labour after being in hospital for a week. And there was just no hope really of Freddie surviving after birth. He was actually very well developed for his gestation, and he lived for an hour in my arms, but it was an extraordinarily difficult time, and for me, my worst day. We didn't know still at the time why it had happened, but for me it was really finding out more about prematurity, why it happens, what we can do to prevent it. And what I learned very quickly was that we haven't come very far. We haven't come very far in terms of research. In at least 5 to 6 decades, we are still treating people that are at risk of premature birth with the same drugs. We can't identify prematurity. And I was filled with just mainly anger and confusion and questions. But it made perfect sense to me in a situation that made none to explore this further.
Caro raised the question that every parent who has a premature baby, no matter what the outcome may be, the question is why? Why did this happen? Why did my baby arrive early? And that's what you as a couple have almost made your life's ambition to try and answer that question for people, not just for yourselves.
So you say our life's ambition, we try and raise funds and we hand it over to some extraordinarily bright and clever people. There's a living saint called Mark Johnson, Professor Mark Johnson, who we now have 3 grown-up children that we simply wouldn't have without Mark. I always find the vocabulary awkward in terms of Caro has an incompetent cervix. It just doesn't seem like it's an appropriate word. It's a cervix that you can't go to full term, and then we understand through Mark that a cervical suture, a simple cervical suture might be able to help in that occasion. There are very many different diagnoses because the reality is preterm birth's an outcome, not a diagnosis, so you often are doing all the research after the event.
Professor Mark Johnson and the Born charity that you support are really highlighting the need to answer these questions, as you said, because despite being the single biggest cause of neonatal death in the UK, premature birth remains an underfunded, as you said, Will, an overlooked area of research. In fact, there have been no new treatments introduced in the last 50 years, Caro, which is what you said. So talk to me about Born and as a charity and the difference they're making.
They are tipping the balance when it comes to premature research. So, the research they're doing is ongoing, and with premature birth, it isn't, obviously our baby died and it was horrific for us. One of the biggest issues of premature birth is lifelong disability, and that comes in many forms, from severe to educational challenges. And what I find difficult to quantify is the limited funds that we put into premature research, given the amount of money we then have to spend as a country to care and take care of babies born with disability.
We talk about the underfunding. When you look at the statistics, you do wonder why it's underfunded, because over 60,000 babies are born too soon in the UK each year. That's roughly 1 in 13. Globally, prematurity kills 1 baby every 30 seconds, the stats. are startling.
It's very reactive, isn't it?
Yeah.
What we're trying to do with Born is be proactive, and it's exactly just to endorse what Caro's saying is chronic illness, disability, problems with education. All these are very common
challenges.
Common challenges that come with being born before sort of 30 weeks, and the cost to society of supporting those children for the rest of their lives is removed immediately by, I know it sounds daft, by keeping them in for another 14 days. If you can buy them 21 days more in the womb. We are parents of 4 for, how do you describe
I
them?
describe my, I hate the word journey, but I am going to use that word, is that I am a raiser of 3 children, but a mother to 4, because Freddie made me a mum. And the feelings that I had are the same feelings that I had when my other children were born. You know, I was still a mother, but then I was a mother in grieving. So for me, that's exactly how I see it. You know, we integrate Fred into the family. The children heard and spoke about Fred at a very young age. You know, all of my children have spoken about him at different stages of their lives. We wanted to give him a purpose, and I really enjoy hearing his name now. And I don't think that anyone that has experienced baby loss, I don't think this is for everybody. I'm not saying that everyone that's experienced baby loss would feel the same way as I do, and I think that should be respected. But I would like to think that Freddie Greenwood's very short life has impacted the world and made a difference. So for me, speaking his name and speaking to you today is cathartic for me, but also a huge positive for the premature and baby loss community.
Like you said, it's about getting people talking about it and approaching it first before it is reactive. Caro and Will, thank you so much for talking to us about Freddie Greenwood and the Born charity. Thank you.
Thank you.
A convicted murderer deported from the UK is offering to return to show his victim's daughter where she is buried more than 50 years on from her death. Nizamuddin Hussain says that he wants to help Muriel Mackay's daughter find her body before he himself dies. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt takes up the story.
Hello, Nizam. This is Diane.
Oh, hello, Diane.
It's an oddly warm greeting for a killer and his victim's daughter.
Hi, how are you?
All the better for seeing you.
Diane's mother, Muriel Mackay, was kidnapped 54 years ago. Her body was never found. Nizam Hussain, and his brother were convicted of her murder and jailed for life. Eventually freed and deported to his native Trinidad, Nizam has offered to show the Mackay family where he buried Muriel's body.
Well, it's very hard for me to talk about this because it's quite painful, but if you can come and help us find her, of course we'll be very glad to bring you over.
I'm quite prepared.
You're quite prepared to come over and explain and show us exactly where you put her?
Yeah.
He's a man of few words.
Nizam says they kept Muriel at their Hertfordshire farm. When she suddenly collapsed and died, he buried her behind a barn. Last year, police searched part of the grounds but found no trace of Muriel. Her family say they dug in the wrong place. Nizam has a new passport, but there's a hurdle to overcome. He's asked the Home Office to lift his deportation order so he can return to the UK and reveal the burial site. He wrote, "I believe I am the only living person who knows where Muriel's body is, and would like her body to be found before I myself die." Muriel was married to Australian newspaper executive Alec Mackay. Her kidnappers mistook her for Anna Murdoch, wife of Alec's boss, Rupert.
What's it like having to talk to the man who killed your mother?
It's very hard, but have you had so many years with nobody to talk to and no leads and no hope of ever finding her body? It's actually a relief to talk to him.
The Home Office is considering Nizam's request to lift his deportation order, and Scotland Yard detectives are deciding if they need to search the farm again. Martin Brunt, Sky News.
And if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can get more on that case by listening to the Sky News Daily podcast. You can listen and subscribe to The Daily wherever you get your podcasts from. Coming up on the UK Tonight, we'll tell you all about this Springer Spaniel who's helping to find an endangered species in the North Yorkshire moors. And it's on. Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. They clash heads as their undisputed title fight is confirmed for February.
I had this tea the night before she'd gone to bed, absolutely fine. I'd carried on working downstairs, and then the day after, I'd gone up to get the girls up, so we're going to have us dinner at Valentine's Day, and I kept shouting her name, and she didn't answer, and I went to her room, and she'd taken her own life during the night. When the police got involved, obviously, and they came back to us with her phone, it had shown that she had been bullied and told to take her own life several times by various people in this group chat.
So that's how you found out that Honey was being bullied? You had no idea? She had not said to you that she was struggling or being targeted by bullies online? No. You found out because police, as part of the investigation, took her phone?
Yeah, I had absolutely no idea why she'd done it at all. It completely knocked wind out of my sails. I weren't seeing it coming at all. The things that these girls were saying were so nasty and evil that I have never heard adults say anything like that. To think that Honey, she was 6 weeks away from being 16, had to deal with that while going through her GCSEs and everything else. It's just horrific. I carry a guilt with me now that I didn't know that was happening, and I look back at little cues thinking, oh, this could have been that, but there were nothing. There were absolutely nothing. And like I said, we were really close. She could tell me anything. We had his own little, we had like the same sense of humour, his own little language and stuff for each other. And she didn't explain why. There were no note. It's just completely, she didn't want to tell me, but she'd tell me anything, and it just didn't make sense for a long time. But there's questions there that I'm never going to get answers for. If we're talking about mental health law, then the worst case scenario from mental health conditions is suicide. They've got to know the start to finish. It's all right saying to these kids, you need to sleep more and eat well and exercise and you'll be okay. We need to say, like, this is what could happen. If not, if you tell that little girl that you don't like it, you hate, blah, 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 then this could happen.
Hello, welcome back to the UK Tonight. Coming up, we'll meet the sniffer dog that is helping conservationists detect endangered water voles in the North Yorkshire moors. That's on the way. But first, David is here with the sport. And I'm going to say it again. It is on. Big news from the world of sport tonight.
Yeah, we were just talking about this in the break. And, you know, it feels like it's been a little quiet on the boxing front for a little while. Now we've got all of these headlines, particularly to do with Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. Now, we've known for a while, we're trying to get them together in the ring. It was meant to be 23rd of December. But you might remember recently Fury was taken the distance by a former UFC champion called Francis Ngannou. And it could have been a very embarrassing defeat and not planned. So as a result of that, maybe a little bit of a slightly humbling experience for him, going for February the 17th instead. Fury, of course, has got 1 belt. Usyk has got 3. Whoever gets there will get all belts, will be unified, undisputed champion of the world in the heavyweight division. And of course they had their press conference. And of course, what we witnessed was peak Tyson Fury. Have a look at this.
I come here to pick a fight. I didn't come here to play games. I didn't get all dressed up for nothing. I come here to fight. Or pick one even. You ugly little man. You ugly little man. Little man.
They get away with being so rude, don't they, at these press conferences? But he's up for the press conference.
Yeah.
Will he be up for the fight come February? That's happening in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Of course, that December the 23rd date has been occupied by other fighters. Yeah. Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder, not fighting each other, fighting separate fights, but that plays into another narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely. And what's interesting here is that these are two fighters who were at the top of their game just a few years ago. I mean, Wilder lost twice to Tyson Fury in 2 extraordinary fights. And as for Anthony Joshua, of course, lost twice to Alexander Usyk. He's managed to, I suppose, recover his reputation since then a little bit. Couple of wins, Jermaine Franklin and Robert Helenius. But this is a fight that has been in the making in ages to get the two together. But they're on the same undercard. So, you know, this is, again, how the mighty have fallen. So for Anthony Joshua, it's Otto Wallin. For Deontay Wilder, it's Joseph Parker. But the idea is that ultimately, if they do win, they maybe meet each other sometime in 2024. So, yes, plenty of boxing news, but not by any means the only sporting news we have for you this evening.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
Caroline Dubois, the new world champion. Caroline is going to take us through some of the women who really inspired her through her career so far. So Caroline, go and have a look.
Yep, let's go.
Caroline, Clarissa was not a surprise when we were speaking before about who you were going to choose. Just tell me a little bit why you've chosen her.
I started boxing when I was 9 and I didn't have many role models. I didn't have many female boxers that I looked up to, admired or even felt on a level where I could understand them and they could be someone that experiences are similar to mine. And I remember going up into squads and I was the only black girl there and I just felt very insecure about how I looked, who I was. I was insecure about my muscles, how big I was compared to all the other girls, and I was insecure about so many silly little things, really, now that I look at it. But at the time, when you're 11, you're 12, you're 15, you know, that stuff that gets you. And being able to see Clarissa Shields, I remember seeing her and she was so big, so strong, so good. I remember being insecure about the fact that I was winning all the time. And then I seen Clarissa Shields and she never lost. She only ever lost one fight. She went to every tournament.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Time for a quick look at the weather now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, Friday's looking mainly fine, but rain is going to move in from the southwest later to bring an unsettled weekend. Before then, there'll be a scattering of showers this evening. Western Britain, though, will see some more general rain. That rain is going to spread eastwards tonight, heavy in places, but will mostly clear to leave just a few showers later. A patchy frost and some fog will develop under clearing skies, especially in the north. Most places looking dry tomorrow morning with plenty of sunshine once the fog lifts, but there will be a few showers around. Wales and the northwest of England looking most at risk from that. Increasing cloud over Ireland will bring rain to the southwest by lunchtime. That rain spreading across Ireland and the southwest of Britain during the afternoon. The wind will pick up there as well. Elsewhere, it's going to stay largely dry, with northern and eastern Britain holding on to the sunshine. Saturday is going to start wet and windy.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now, as ever, we like to leave you with something weird and wonderful from across the UK at the end of the show. And tonight we are heading to the North Yorkshire Moors, where a Springer Spaniel is helping conservationists to find a very small endangered animal. Reed has been specifically trained to help sniff out water voles. This is in an effort to monitor the endangered animals. The number of water voles at the North York Moors National Park has been recorded by volunteers for many years, but with numbers decreasing, they needed a bit of help. That's Reed in action, and I'm joined now by his handler, Rachel Cripps, and ecologist Zara Hanshaw. And I'm reliably informed that Reed himself is with us, having a little rest. I can't see, he's just out of shot. Can he have a look at camera? Has he been camera shot? There he is. I was promised Reed. There he is. We'll let him have a little rest because he's been very busy. Rachel, I'll come to you first. Obviously, humans were recording water voles, but you needed a bit of extra help from Reed. Just describe to me what Reed does, how he helps.
Yeah, so Reed is looking for signs of water voles, basically. So water voles mark their territories with latrines, so they kind of poo in specific places, and that's really what he's looking for. It can be quite difficult for people to see, especially if it's really challenging terrain to get through, and we were given some of the more difficult to accessible sites across the North York Moors to go and investigate.
Watching sniffer dogs is absolutely fascinating because they are so quick. Look at that, the speed and the enthusiasm. But as soon as they spot something of interest, what do?
So Reed is trained to do a passive indication when he finds the target that he's looking for. So that is usually a sit and a stare. Obviously, some of this terrain is quite challenging, so he might just freeze. But yeah, it's passive. He will freeze, stare at the target, and wait for me to give him his reward.
I can see him behind you, tail wagging. I wonder what he's sniffing out back there. Probably a treat at this time of night. What's his accuracy rate?
Well, he's been great so far. Well, it's difficult to put an actual figure on it, but yeah, he's done us really proud.
He's pretty good. Zara, talk to us about the wider picture of water voles in the North Yorks Moor. What is it you're trying to do there?
Yeah, so we've been surveying water voles within the national park since about the 1990s, and over that year, and this was sort of seen nationally and within the national park, there's been a real decline in the number of water voles that we're finding that are being recorded for a few different reasons. So we got Reed out really to go and to do some more surveys, and because he's good at getting into those places that are a little bit harder to access, a bit harder for us and for our volunteers to access, get him out and have a look and see if he can find some signs in areas that perhaps we've not recorded water voles in the last few years, but historically we have had the records.
Yeah, they're endangered. Obviously, you want to record them to monitor their numbers, but what are you doing to preserve those numbers?
At the moment, we're still trying to figure out where we have got them within the national park, and then we will use that information to figure out how the best way we can go about conserving them. One of the big threats that they're facing nationally and within the North York Moors is American mink. So American mink are an introduced species, and the females and the juveniles are small enough to go into water voles' burrows. So what they do when they see a predator is they will go and they will hide in their burrow, but unfortunately mink can follow them into their burrows. And so one mink could wipe out an entire colony of water voles within a matter of weeks. So it's looking at methods to control mink. And then also within the national park, we're looking at trying to open up some of our water
Coming to the end of the show, Reed doing some really important work there. Zara, Rachel and Reed, thank you for joining us. Thank